Hi, I'm Kevin Werbach, professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies, from broadband to blockchain. Today, AI is promising to transform our world. But AI needs accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's developed and deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Today, I'm joined by Walter Haydock, founder of StackAware, which helps companies manage AI security, compliance, and privacy risks with a particular focus on ISO 42001 certification. We talk about his path from the military and cybersecurity to AI governance, the difference between voluntary frameworks and certifiable standards for AI, what ISO 42000 readiness actually entails, benefits for firms that make the investment, and what the ideal combination of certification, audits, insurance, and legal safe harbors for AI would look like. Walter, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI.
Kevin, thanks for having me on.
First, how did you get into this field of AI governance? Because you didn't necessarily have what I would think is the traditional path.
So I spent the early part of my career in the U.S. military and government. I was a Marine Corps intelligence and reconnaissance officer. I worked on Capitol Hill as a congressional staffer and also was a targeting analyst at the National Counterterrorism Center. And in all of those experiences, I thought I understood chaos and how to deal with it. But when I decided to move into the private sector a little bit later in my career, I encountered a whole new level of disorganization and chaos as well. And I initially worked in the cybersecurity field at a bunch of different software companies and developed an understanding of how to apply some of these military risk management techniques to the problem of data protection, of compliance, of combating attackers, and decided to eventually launch my own firm, StackAware. And after some initial iteration and unfolding, as one of my mentors calls it, we decided to focus on the problem of AI risk management and governance, and have been working on that for almost 3 years at this point.
Mm-hmm. So obviously in the military and in cybersecurity, counterterrorism, you need to deal with risks. But different kinds of risks than private organizations are dealing with largely. So what do you take from that experience? What does it actually mean to apply some of those military principles to this kind of domain?
Well, whether you're in the military or you're in the private sector, there are really only four things you can do with the risk. And those are: you can avoid the risk by not doing the activity that's causing it. You can transfer the risk by buying insurance, by an indemnification, by a contractual term. You can mitigate the risk by applying some sort of control, whether it's a safety control in the military or a technical control in the security or AI governance context. And then fourth and finally, you can accept the risk, which means that you understand something could go wrong along the way, but at the end of the day, the juice is worth the squeeze, so you're going to press ahead anyway.
How do you decide which of those to choose in any situation?
The only way to make an informed decision when it comes to risk management is quantitative analysis.
Mm.
And historically, organizations have done a lot of what is colloquially known as heat mapping when it comes to risks. So saying we've got a low probability but high impact risk, and ergo, that is a medium overall risk. That's what I describe as doing math with colors, which unfortunately doesn't really make sense. And I found myself wrapping myself and others in axles trying to figure out exactly how you do that math with colors. So my recommendation is to just avoid that entirely and focus on quantitative assessment. And when you do quantitative assessment, you can understand what is the dollar value of a given event occur, or the dollar value of a given risk materializing. And if you take annual rate of occurrence times single loss expectancy and then look at the exposure factor, you can do that math to understand what the value of a given risk is. And why that's key is because it lets you compare that to the value that you're going to obtain from conducting whatever action it is. And then also the cost of the controls, whether that's mitigating the risk or transferring it through insurance or some other method.
Great. So I want to get into it more specifically, but first, just one more general question. What is it that appealed to you about AI governance coming out of cybersecurity? What made you think this was the area to focus on?
When I was first leaving the public sector and I was in business school, I actually did a lot of self-education in terms of AI. I was considering pursuing machine learning engineering as a career path and actually did a nano degree from a company called Udacity, taught myself how to code and really loved the subject matter and decided that I eventually wanted to wrap that into, my work in the future. I went into the cybersecurity field out of business school and then saw the two fields merging together in terms of their significance. And that led me to pursue the AI governance and risk management field as the focus of my company.
Mhm. And in general, what do you think is the biggest gap in that area? What is it that most firms are missing when it comes to AI governance?
The biggest gap for most firms is understanding their exposure versus their actual risk appetite.
Mm.
So, on the one hand, you will have companies that don't really have a good idea of what AI tools and systems are in use. And on the other hand, they'll have very restrictive and what I would consider to be boilerplate policies
Mhm.
that are very black and white, say things like don't create intellectual property risk with AI or use AI responsibly, which from a practical perspective is not really helpful guidance. And that puts employees in a very tough spot where they need to navigate the pressure of getting their job done with these sometimes draconian and unrealistic requirements. So, having a realistic and actionable approach to AI risk management is absolutely key.
And you've been something of an advocate for the ISO 42001 certification framework. First, for those who aren't familiar, just talk about what that is.
ISO 42001 is the global standard for building an AI management system. And that is a set of policies, procedures, and technical controls to harness AI effectively and manage the risk associated with it at the same time. It's similar to the ISO 27001 information security management system standard, but ISO 42001 is even broader in its applicability because it requires you to look outside the organization and look at things like societal and environmental impacts from the use of AI. So it is a comprehensive way to guide your organization's use of artificial intelligence.
And how is it different from other frameworks or regulations that people may be familiar with, like the NIST framework or some of the European or American laws that deal with AI governance?
I bucket frameworks into three different categories. So the first category would be a piece of legislation like the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act or Colorado's SB 205, the Colorado AI Act. For those, it's really a binary. Are you in compliance or are you not in compliance? And the only way you find out you're not is through an enforcement action. Of course, there are best practices, there are more specific guidelines you need to follow for those requirements. But that is one category of framework when it comes to AI or more broadly.
Mhm.
The second category are things that are self attestable or voluntary standards. You mentioned the NIST artificial intelligence risk management framework. That's one. The Open Web Application Security Project's top 10 for generative AI is another example of a voluntary framework. And then the third category of framework are those certifiable standards where you can have a third party come in and confirm that you are meeting the requirements of the standard. ISO 42001 is one of those, but additional examples include the High Trust AI Security Certification and then the AI UC1 standard, which is relatively new.
What's the difference in a standard that's certifiable?
Can you drill down into that a little bit in terms of difference between those standards I mentioned or between standards that are certifiable and not?
Yeah, exactly. What is it that would look different in terms of what a firm would have to do or what the requirements would be of something that can be externally certified versus something that is purely voluntary and self-certified?
The biggest difference between a self-certified standard and an externally certifiable standard is the credibility that you would bring to customers. So you can claim that you're adhering to ISO 42001, that you're adhering to the EU AI Act, and you very well may be. With that said, customers are going to have far more confidence in that claim if you have a third party who is independent come in and confirm that you are meeting the requirements of that standard according to their guidelines for conducting audits. So there's no way you can achieve a certification around the NIST AI risk management framework. There are attestations and there are ways that you can have an auditor come in and say, yeah, you're probably following those guidelines, but there is no true certification for that. ISO 42001 is different because it was designed from the beginning to allow an independent auditor to come in and confirm or deny that you're meeting the requirements of the standard.
Presumably that means there has to be a standard for the auditor.
Absolutely. There is a standard for the auditor. All the certification bodies are required to meet specific guidelines when it comes to auditing artificial intelligence management systems. In the case of AI, it's ISO 42006 is the auditing standard, which guides how these certification bodies conduct their work. And they are overseen by accreditation bodies, which will review what they're doing. And actually, for last year, StackAware, during its own ISO 42001 surveillance audit, our audit was witnessed by the ANSI National Accreditation Board. So we had someone looking over the shoulder of our auditor while we were being audited.
Is there an ecosystem of auditors that's developing for ISO 42001?
There are a set of auditors that are currently accredited to conduct ISO 42001 audits, and we work with several of them. We are not necessarily beholden to them. We don't necessarily have to work with them. We will work with any auditor that our customer wants to use. But we are separate from them in that we are a consulting firm. So we help organizations get ready for the audit, and we necessarily cannot be involved in the certification side of things
Sure.
because that firm needs to maintain independence from the process of preparing for the audit. So there are, I'd say in the US, there are probably a dozen, maybe more firms that are currently accredited to
Mhm.
grant ISO 42001 certification, and that number is growing.
Okay. And you mentioned that StackAware went through the process yourself. So you can speak with some authority on what it means to actually get certified. What should an organization understand is required if they want to go down this path?
ISO 42001 certification is a heavy lift for an organization. And that's because it requires things like executive buy in, it requires a full understanding of the scope of your management system, and it's going to require ongoing resources for maintenance, for doing internal audits, things of that nature. So, being fully committed to the process is really important up front. Now, with that said, if you put in the right level of investment, you can use ISO 42001 as a way to improve the functioning of your AI systems, as a way to accelerate your business objectives through both effective risk management, but also monitoring and measuring of your AI performance, training of your employees, and improving trust with customers who have improved confidence that you're using artificial intelligence safely, securely, and responsibly.
Can it also potentially give you some legal protection under these laws we talked about?
ISO 42001 is very interesting in that it gives you two different levels of protection when it comes to regulatory compliance. So the first level is that it requires incorporating what the standard calls external issues into your AI management system. So things like laws are certainly external requirements. They can also include things like contractual requirements, the business landscape, things like that. So ISO 42001 gives you a system for incorporating these various demands on your business into your AI management system. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is that in specific cases, for example, Colorado's SB 205, that law calls out ISO 42001 compliance as providing safe harbor under certain circumstances under that law. So it's unique in that it's called out by a specific law as giving you protection if you're meeting other requirements.
Mhm. And you mentioned a little bit the work that StackAware does with companies in terms of becoming ISO 42001 compliant. What are the major areas that companies need help on to go through this process?
StackAware generally works with companies in three phases. So, in the first phase, we'll come in, we will help them do an asset inventory, make sure we understand everything that's in scope, evaluate the risk of those systems. That includes, in some cases, doing AI red teaming to evaluate the security and effectiveness of the controls for these AI systems. In the second phase, we will help the company apply administrative controls, including building their AI management system documentation, building the policies and procedures, ensuring management reviews are being conducted on a regular cadence. And then in the third phase, we will help the companies apply technical controls in accordance with Annex A of the ISO 42001 standard. And then we can actually perform an internal audit, which is essentially a way of checking prior to the external audit that these controls are functioning effectively.
As you mentioned, it's a heavy lift. What are the ideal characteristics of an organization that should go down this path?
There are three broad types of organizations that would benefit most from ISO 42001 certification. So the first are AI powered B2B startups, because these organizations generally only have the capacity to pursue one standard. ISO 42001 checks a lot of boxes at the same time. It addresses security, it addresses privacy, it addresses societal impact. And I can speak from personal experience that we've used our certification to build confidence with our customers when we're going through a procurement process. A second type of company that would benefit from ISO 42001 certification is one that's training on customer data. And there are many examples out there of companies that have gotten bad press because of the way they've disclosed or not disclosed what they're doing with customer data. Examples include Zoom, DocuSign, Slack. I'm not saying whether or not these were valid responses to what these companies were doing, but nonetheless, there was a public outcry based on some disclosures about what they were doing. If you have an ISO 42001 certified AI management system, you can say, we are following these principles and we have external verification that we're taking these measures. Finally, I would recommend that heavily regulated companies, especially in healthcare and finance, would also benefit from ISO 42001 readiness and certification. That's because of things like the Colorado AI Act, providing safe harbor under certain circumstances. But more broadly, it gives you a comprehensive way to evaluate all of the requirements levied upon the organization and filter them through the lens of artificial intelligence to ensure that you're checking all your boxes, that you have all your ducks in a row. And at the same time, you're actually managing the risk of using AI.
You painted a picture of firms that are willing to invest more seriously in AI governance. being rewarded and market forces actually reinforcing that kind of behavior. And that's a vision that I also really share. But are we really seeing that in the market? Do we have evidence to suggest that the firms that are most serious, whether it's ISO 42001 or not, are actually getting that kind of benefit?
I think there's a timely example where there's certainly been a bump to a firm that at least appears to be applying a more stringent set of controls when it comes to AI governance, and that's Anthropic, which recently was designated by the Department of War as a supply chain risk, which has a specific definition under US code. I won't necessarily weigh in on the merits of that designation or not, or whether Anthropic was acting in a more upright manner than their competitor, OpenAI. But what matters is that people are reacting to the perception
Yeah.
that Anthropic is behaving in a more responsible and ethical manner. And as a result, I saw today, looks like installations of Anthropic were up something like 300%, or their Claude AI tool was up 300% as a result. Whether that's causation, correlation, maybe Anthropic's just a really good AI tool. They've certainly been getting a lot of press
Mhm.
for just being good. It's unclear, but there's certainly some benefit to the perception that you're using artificial intelligence responsibly from a commercial perspective.
Mm. I mean, it's certainly true of the frontier labs, and they've taken different approaches in terms of governance and so forth. With regard to enterprises, though, at least my perception of what happened in cyber is, even though there's a really clear imperative given the losses that can happen and the threats, that broadly speaking, even though there are all these notification requirements and so forth, the market has a hard time perceiving. If you have a big incident, then you may take some loss, but we don't really see, at least in my perception, that the companies that are doing the work overall are getting that kind of halo effect. Um, and you've spent more time in that field than I have, so tell me if I'm wrong there. But are we going to see that kind of dynamic in the AI world, or will it be something like what you described with Anthropic more broadly for deployers?
There's certainly something to be said about the market not actually caring about cybersecurity. And there is good evidence that stock prices are only temporarily
Mhm.
impacted as a result of data breaches and related incidents. With that said, I think we're still in the early days when it comes to cybersecurity and AI governance. And I think organizations are only beginning to understand the impacts of mishandling customer data, of
Mhm.
using AI systems unethically or in a careless manner, because the costs are going to be borne over large periods of time. If you look at, for example, data breaches, the consequences will only be felt down the road. And I think with artificial intelligence, in some areas or some manners, the impacts are going to be felt more rapidly than with a
Mhm.
data breach, because if you have an autonomous system that goes out of control, it deletes a bunch of data or knocks a system offline, you're going to see impacts that are much more readily apparent, and they're going to happen much more quickly. So I think you're going to see more market concern with respect to cybersecurity, but even more so with AI governance, because the potential for impacts is greater.
So many firms now are in this environment where they're pushing to go fast with AI, and that's often in tension with risk and legal and the groups that are overseeing those control functions. And again, I make this argument myself that similar to the one that you made earlier. Doing the investment in governance redounds to all sorts of other benefits for the firm, but I find that argument doesn't always go over well with management that just says, I know it all sounds good, but we've got to keep ahead of our competitors or catch up to our competitors and just deploy as fast as possible. Then we'll figure it out." So, what have you found actually works in getting traction with organizations that it's worth making this investment, including in something like ISO 42001, which is not trivial to do?
ISO 42001 is definitely a risk management framework, but it is much more than that. And I think there are lots of companies that are going out there and have no idea what they're doing from a business perspective with artificial intelligence. They're seeing their competitors do things and deciding that they need to go out and use AI as well. They don't even know what they're doing, though. They're not tracking metrics, they're not understanding effectiveness. And in organizations that are kind of rushing out there to deploy AI, they may be buying duplicative tools. They're wasting money on these resources. They're bringing in consultants, even though the organization doesn't even know what they're trying to do.
Mhm.
So you definitely need a effective business strategy before you start worrying about governance, but the two go hand in hand, because if you don't understand what you're doing from a business perspective, there's no real point in talking about AI governance. But AI governance can help you clarify your objectives when it comes to how you're deploying and purchasing these systems.
Does ISO 42001 provide that kind of quantitative assessment of risk that you were talking about before, or is it more general framework for management and there's still more specific that has to be done?
ISO 42001 is incredibly high level.
Mhm.
That's with respect to risk assessment and treatment, it's with respect to measurement and monitoring. With that said, it gives you a framework for how to conduct these types of assessments. And
Mhm.
I can tell you from personal experience that StackAware has made it through certification using a quantitative approach to AI risk management. So it doesn't dictate that you need to do your risk
Mhm.
assessments in a certain way, only that they are repeatable and that you achieve the same results given the same inputs. So it gives you a backbone for building a risk management and an AI evaluation program.
Mhm. The standard is, I think, 2.5 years old now, which is not that long, but AI moves so fast. How can any standard keep up with the way the technology is advancing?
Having a standard that is flexible and high level is a benefit when technology is advancing rapidly because it doesn't necessarily need to change that quickly with the times. So I think ISO 42001 can use an overhaul already at this point, mainly because of the way that it's structured. And there are some elements that, in my opinion, are duplicative and overlapping. So cleaning those up would certainly help. However, that's less of an issue when it comes to the pace of technology and more
Mhm.
of one when it comes to design and how you're architecting the standard. So I think a key benefit of ISO 42001 is that it is high level. The alternative approach would be something like the High Trust AI Security Certification or AIUC 1, which affirmatively attempts to keep up with the pace of change
Mhm.
and releases quarterly adjustments that incorporate threat environment and technological developments.
Mhm. And can you talk about how certification ties in with insurance for AI liability?
There are already programs in place when it comes to certification frameworks and insurance discounts, additional coverages, things like that. StackAware recently entered into a partnership with Armilla AI, which is a firm specifically focused on AI insurance, and they also partner with A-Line, which is a firm that we work with on the auditing side to verify the effectiveness of ISO 42001 controls. And Armilla has said that they will incorporate the fact of ISO 42001 certification into their underwriting process. So I think as we move forward, the future is going to be a firm will have an auditor verify how it's operating its AI systems in a very machine readable way. There will be data pipelines that the
Mhm.
auditors will be able to connect to. And then the auditors will confirm that everything's in order, that there are no funny business, so to speak, when it comes to the presentation of the data. And then an insurance firm or an underwriter can come in and look at that data and make very educated decisions about what sort of risk they're assuming. And if the company's doing a good job at managing the risk, they can get discounts because of exactly those types of controls that they've implemented under ISO 42001 or a similar standard.
What do you think are the biggest factors that will influence how quickly and how successfully that model develops?
Even in 2026, I think we're unfortunately a long ways off
Hmm.
from a truly machine readable way to evaluate the total risk posed by a company or its use of AI systems. And unfortunately, audit practices are still a little bit old school in that they rely on visual observation. They rely on interview, which of course has its purposes. You can understand if there are gaps in knowledge when you're speaking with people. I would love to see over the next 5 to 10 years a much greater focus on machine data, on reproducibility when it comes to auditing, so that 90% of an audit is just pushing a button to fire a bunch of APIs that test whether certain systems are functioning as intended. And then the other 10% is the human element, focusing on scoping, making sure that there's no evasion on the part of the audited company, and then, you know, interviews with key leaders at the organization to evaluate their level of competence. So I think we're unfortunately on the other side of that spectrum right now, where it's 10% automated, 90% manual, but would love to see that flip over the next decade or so.
Great. Well, we have to wrap up, but Walter, thank you so much for sharing all this with us.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me on.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening. If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program, featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.